to introduce Bob Whitaker from the States. He's probably familiar to many of you as the founder of MAD in America, which has given rise to a number of offspring, including MAD in the UK. And it's a platform for challenging the paradigm of drug-based care for so-called mental illnesses. And he's written an awful lot of stuff as a journalist, best known for his most recent book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, which is an investigation of the hidden story of the damaging impact of psychiatric drugs, and which has won a number of awards. So I think he's going to tell us all about how he became involved in the strange and murky world of mental health. Over to you.
Well, thanks. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's been a pretty incredible day, and I don't really know of a conference like this that had such a gathering of people, and I've been really sort of lamenting that it couldn't have been in person when you get to be with people, be with the audience. So really, it's a real honor to be here. And I have to say, I'm still laughing about James's song, which was really great. What I was asked to speak about was, how I came really to switch my thinking and have and the beliefs I do have now about psychiatry and its treatments. And who asked me to speak on this, I thought, well, this will be a rather narcissistic topic to talk, but I think can be instructive in this sense. We were talking earlier in the day and like on a panel, how do we have system change? And big system change, I think, arises because right now we have our society organized around one sort of narrative, the conventional narrative, which I was once a believer in. And then what this conference is doing is offering a different narrative, different possibilities, a different way of thinking about psychiatric care, mental health. And to the other does have hopefully some, merit what change is possible. So my background is, I spent many years covering medicine and science for newspapers. And then there was a time, actually, I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School. So I had a very traditional sort of rooting in science and medicine. And one of the things when you're a newspaper reporter covering medicine and science, it's generally thought of as a story of progress. Science is a story of progress. Medicine is a story of progress. And although I had no particular interest in psychiatry, in 1998, I co-wrote a series for the Boston Globe that looked at abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. Now, at that time, I had a completely conventional understanding of what was going on in psychiatry. So my understanding was researchers had discovered that schizophrenia, depression, and other psychiatric disorders were due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and that we now had drugs that fixed those imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. Now, that's a story that tells of incredible medical progress. In fact, if this story is true, I'd say it's one of the greatest medical discoveries of ever, perhaps the greatest medical discovery ever, given how complex the brain is. So in that series, that was one of the frameworks for it, but it's not important. But while I was doing that series, I came upon a couple of studies that really belied that narrative of progress. The first was a couple of studies actually done by the World Health Organization, in which they compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the US and 6 other, quote, developed countries with outcomes in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria. And in each time, one was a 2-year study, one was a 5-year study, the outcomes were much, much better in the poor countries. And listen to this, actually conclude that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, given all this story of progress, I was wondering, well, why would that be? And then there was a second study done by Harvard researchers in which they looked at recovery rates over the past 100 years for people diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they found that recovery rates today were actually getting worse than they had been 30, 40 years ago. And they were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. So that too belied that story of progress. So I was confronted with this since I had one belief system that told of this great understanding of the pathology of mental disorders, drugs that were very effective, and now I had studies that were challenging that narrative of progress. And I actually got a contract to write a book, which became a book called Mad in America, that to look into, among other things, why were outcomes for schizophrenia, people diagnosed with schizophrenia, so poor? Now, one of the first things I did once I got that contract was try to investigate this story of chemical imbalances. So I began calling up psychiatric experts, researchers, and I said, can you just tell me where in the literature I can find that it was discovered that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine activity, or people with depression had too little serotonergic activity? And I swear to God, this is what I was told. Well, that's just a metaphor, the like insulin for diabetes. And I said, well, I understand like insulin for diabetes is a metaphor. Just tell me where you found that there was this chemical abnormality. And once I raised that question to researchers, here's what they said. Well, we actually didn't find that. We use this metaphor because we know these drugs are good for people, and this provides a way to make them understand that the drugs are good for them. And, you know, I was really gobsmacked because one of the values of medicine, of course, is you don't lie to your patients. But in addition, I suddenly had this confirmation that, well, the story that we were organizing ourselves around, society, the United States and elsewhere, was not a true scientific story. Anyway, then in Mad in America, I basically looked at the treatment of, quote, the seriously mentally ill or the MAD from colonial times until today. And when I did this, you see some recurring themes that really were part of my process for switching how I thought about things. The first theme is whatever the doctors do, they're going to call it effective. So, for example, in the late 1700s, they would do crazy things like spin people around until they became nauseous. There was even something called dunking therapy, where they would practically drown people. And there was another thing called the tranquilizer chair, where they would, you know, put people in a chair and keep them there for 36, 48 hours and bleed them until they were so depleted they could hardly, move. And all of these deemed to be effective then. And then as we move through time, no matter what they were doing, whatever the doctors were doing, they would always declare it effective. That's the first thing. The second thing you discover is that most of these therapies, and we're talking about, quote, the seriously mentally ill, had the effect of quieting people, or in some ways making them less energetic. And maybe they would be talking about how these were curative, but really were changing being in these ways of quieting people, making people less energetic, less engaged with the environments. The third thing you see was so often these medical therapies were based on a conception of human beings, quote, the man, that really denied them their humanity. So, for example, in the colonial days, they said, oh, reason is what makes human. The mad, by virtue of having lost their reason, really have descended to a lower level of being. And that's one of the reasons we can treat them as brutes. And then if you go forward in this history of the treatment of the mentally ill, you come into a eugenic era. And under the eugenic idea was that you start grading people in terms of how successful they are and who you want to breed. And they would put at the bottom of this list, the eugenicists, those people who were seen as, mad or struggling with psychiatric problems, etc. And once they denigrated people in that way with these eugenic ideas, you see that what is introduced, sterilization, you see there's a series of brain damaging therapeutics introduced in the 1930s and 1940s. And this actually culminates with the introduction of surgical lobotomy, which is, and what you do is you destroy the frontal lobes, which is the very part of our brain that makes us most human. And what did people say? What did the doctors say at the time? This can be curative. The very work can at least help people, and it's almost certain not to harm people. And then when you see that the surgery is being assessed this way, it's because they didn't value people for who they were. You can even read tracts that say, well, maybe we knock them again to a lower level of being, but that's better than what they were. And just to understand this sort of societal delusion, in 1949, the inventor of surgical lobotomy, Igaz Muniz, won the Nobel Prize for doing so. Now, in the conventional narrative of psychiatry, history of psychiatry, it goes like this. Oh yeah, there were some problems in the old days. Some of those therapies were barbaric, but then in 1955, we get chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic, and this kicks off a psychopharmacological revolution, a great advance in care. And again, in the words, you do hear that, antipsychotic, as if it's an antidote to psychosis, antidepressants, as if they're antidotes to depression, etc. And as the conventional narrative goes, this is what made it possible to empty the asylums, because people with these drugs could now live fairly successfully in the community. But once again, as you go back into that history, you find that when chlorpromazine was first introduced, it was actually heralded for causing chemical lobotomy. But that was seen as a good thing, a change in being similar to surgical lobotomy. And that was seen as a good thing because surgical lobotomy, not many years before, had won the Nobel Prize. So in this history that I was sort of telling in Mad in America, I could see a continuation with the past in this modern psychopharmacological era. And the continuation was, well, what did these drugs really do? Well, they did quiet people. They rob people of energy, often rob them of a capacity to really engage in life. People complained about feeling like zombies, etc. So you actually see a continuation with some of these past therapies. Of course, that's not the story being told to the public. And so these themes you continually see in the history. So these themes where therapies that knock people down, quiet them, are seen as helpful. That's number one. And number two, what you see again and again in the history was that the voice of those who are treated are not listened to. So they weren't listened to in the in the colonial times because they were seen as, oh, they've lost their reason. During the eugenic times, they were basically being removed from society, seen as a threat to society. And then if you go into the modern era of the drug era, there was basically a rising up of ex-patients in the 1970s who were saying, we want to be the authors of our own lives. Many of us don't like these drugs, and yet that voice was never listened to within the conventional narrative because psychiatry as a profession said, oh, those people aren't reliable witnesses to their own lives. Then going finally forward with Mad in America is I looked at the introduction of two things. I looked at the new drugs, the SSRIs and atypical antipsychotics, and it was very easy to see, one, that the trials were biased by design. Two, that the story being told to the public was totally out of sync with actually the science in terms of what the actual results were with the drug trials. So add that all up together and came to the understanding that the stories we as a society told to ourselves, which was a story really coming out of the medical profession and more recently enhanced by pharmaceutical companies, was a fake story. It came to a story of science. It came to us a story of medicine. It came to us a story of medical progress, the chemical imbalance story. But when you looked at the science, it was belied by that. In other words, the science itself didn't support that public story that was being told to us. And by the way, going in this modern era, incorporated in scientific literature was actually research that said, oh, these drugs are causing, I'm talking about antipsychotics, changes in the brain that make people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would be in the normal course of the illness. So it wasn't just that they didn't find that the drugs fixed the chemical imbalance, they found that the drugs caused a change that may be making people worse. So as a newspaper reporter, as a journalist, your job is to be, to accurately and clearly communicate to the public what are the real scientific findings. And what I saw in my own journey at this moment was, before I had come upon those studies, I was a communicator of a story of progress that wasn't true. So in fact, I wasn't serving the public well. As a journalist, if I was communicating the story of progress that yes, served psychiatry's interests as a guild, yes, served pharmaceutical interests, but wasn't true. Now the other part, and this is part of the switch in my thinking, the other part that so changed me was, as I told this history, you can come upon a couple times of care that are very different. They're non-medical. Now, the first one you see it in the early 1800s. It's called moral therapy. It was really developed by Quakers in northern England, late 1790s. And here was their thinking. And it was a non-medical approach. Their thinking was, we don't know what's wrong when people, quote, lose their sanity. That's number one. Two, but we do know they are children of God, and as children of God, they may have an inner capacity to regain their sanity. Three, and this is the most important thing, they are brethren. They're not the other. They're not to be denigrated. They are us. They are like us. And if you begin with that sentiment, that value, you ask yourself, well, what do we all need to be well? Well, we need shelter, we need someone to love, we need meaning in life. In other words, we need to have an environment that nurtures us. And one of the things with moral therapy is they try to create such an environment. Be out in nature, eat well. And by the way, in the moral therapy asylum that sprung up, and they sprung up here in the United States as well, the idea was you would reflect back, the therapists, the staff at the place would reflect back to the person, not an image of a person who was ill or who couldn't be in society, but rather someone who could function well in society. So the idea was to reflect on their capacity to be and function well. And the idea was, well, we'll use exercise and nature and good air to restore health. And here's the most important thing for me. Even by a medical value, that environmental care turned out better outcomes in terms of people coming in who clearly were really struggling with their sense of reality and getting them back in society. So even by that medical value, it was a much more effective form of treatment. And then you can also see in this history a project such as the Soteria Project in the United States in the 1970s, which was launched by the head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health at that time, Lauren Mosher. It really was environment can heal people. We're not going to diagnose people. We're going to understand that there are many pathways, quote, to madness, but that environment can be healing. And by the way, just it's a philosophy of being that, you know, craziness or suffering is a part of the human condition. And that was successful too. And what happened? It was crushed because it was such a threat to the biological model and all the profits that flow from that biological model. So what you hear from that experience one final thing. In Mad in America, I also incorporated into that entire history what were, quote, patients, those who were being treated, saying about the treatments, because I thought you have to listen to their voice. And by the end of the book, I felt their voice, the voice of, quote, ex-patients, had the side of reason upon it. It also had the side of authenticity upon it. And you also had the sense that silencing this voice was cruel, a form of bad medicine, unjust, just morally wrong in every single way, and that you're never going to have a good form of care as a society unless you listen to those who, quote, are being treated. And so you can see my shift. I began with thinking that, oh, this is just a biological problem, and we're making great progress. That was the first part. The second part was by digging into science, finding it wasn't true. There wasn't this progress in outcomes. There wasn't this progress in discovering the biological nature. And then three was seeing in this history, this denigrating of people over time, which is so contrary to any sort of moral value, and finding finally really that the sense of truth was in, you could find it in the experiences of those who had been, you know, diagnosed, etc. Anyway, real quickly, I then so I wrote that book. I really had shifted my understanding and my sense that environmentalism was, you know, that we needed to create nurturing environments for people, which means shelter, jobs, etc. And then Anatomy of an Epidemic, the book that Lucy taught, just extended this to, you know, how did we get this new society where so many people are being medicated, we're medicating our kids, diagnosing our kids, and then just asking quick question. Is it helping in a public health basis? Is it reducing the burden of stress in our society? No, it doesn't meet that medical value. We were told that all these drugs fix chemical imbalances. Is that true? No. What is happening to people within this medical framework over the long term? Does this diagnosis and treatment, this medical course, does it increase the likelihood they'll be functioning well and asymptomatic? Those are medical terms. Years later? No. In fact, what you find in the scientific literature is quite the opposite, that diagnosis plus treatment over the long term increases the likelihood that people will become functionally impaired and remain symptomatic. Now, again, that doesn't mean it happens to everybody, but in the aggregate, that's what this paradigm of care was creating, was a public health debacle, and on the whole, over the long term, worsening. So I became convinced that what we really, and I also in anatomy looked at, well, what are the forces that lead to this false storytelling? But anyway, I became convinced that we as a society have organized ourselves around a false narrative of science, meaning a narrative that says, we know these things are illnesses, we know these drugs are effective, maybe they fix chemical imbalances, etc. That wasn't true. And the reason I came to the conclusion it wasn't true is because I spent time with I dug into the scientific literature that came from the promoters of that very story. And two, that if you're going to have any sort of real narrative that makes sense, you have to listen to people who are those who are being treated, diagnosed, etc. And finally, on this question of diagnosis, why don't I believe in diagnoses? Well, once more, it comes from even a medical approach to this. So in medicine, for a diagnosis to be valuable, it has to be valid. In other words, it has to be both reliable and valid. Reliable meaning that the patient goes to two different doctors to make the same diagnosis, and valid meaning, well, you have found some pathology, or you have found some characteristic genetics, or you have found that this group of people responds to this drug and another group responds to a different drug, et cetera. So it's in 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association, in the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, really put its stake in the ground and said, we're going to call these things illnesses in the brain. And they said at that time, oh, this is a hypothesis, but we expect to validate these hypotheses with research in the next 35 years. So they do that research. Do they find the genetics? No. Do the diagnoses end up reliable? No. Because as you know, people get all sorts of diagnoses. Do we see that one diagnostic category really responds to a drug and another one to another drug? No. So on all these sort of medical terms, you do not see the diagnoses, medical criteria being validated. And as they were creating the fifth edition of the DSM, you had this table of researchers in the psychiatric community saying, have we validated these diagnoses? And they said no. And so their own sense was, we're telling people we've validated these as discrete illnesses, but among themselves they're saying these are just constructs. And again, you have this mismatch where you're not being honest with the public. And finally, and then I'll sign off here, I think I got 1 minute or something. The problem with diagnoses, in my opinion, and with this big sort of picture I'm trying to say, I think, we just need to create a new narrative. one that does it based on a sense of humility, based on an understanding that to suffer is to be human, and also to recover is built within us as well, and that we are creatures that respond to our environment. And finally, what I think the reason diagnoses, besides being, giving a false sense of what is known, a diagnosis puts the problem within the individual, within that individual's head. And it removes the sense that we live in a society, and it removes any culpability from the society for creating a just society, an equal society, creating good schools. And so as we try to create a new narrative, which I think this conference is really about, I think we need a narrative that says, it's a narrative of philosophy. Who are we? What is the capacity? Are we each other's caretakers? And to acknowledge that we are creatures that respond to an environment, so we need to make better environments. So that's my journey. Thank you.